John? I'm bookended by Johns. John and John.
Cool. Easy name to remember. You'll be okay.
Good evening. My name is Susan Amos Palmer. I'm director of the Growing Through Loss program and the North Suburban Grief Coalition. I welcome you tonight to Abiding Savior and thank you for taking the risk of coming out and being with us tonight. There's so many things happening now in the Twin Cities that it's sort of been challenging doing anything lately. I also want to remind you that if your church is one of the ones that sponsors the coalition, be sure to thank them for their support. We have donation boxes in the back, so if you want to contribute something, you may. We don't charge admission because we think it's a good program and we want people to not find funds to be a hardship. But we also do accept donations. I am going to open tonight with a reading from out of this book called The Wind Blows, The Ice Breaks, Poems of Loss and Renewal by Minnesota poets, edited by Ted Bauman and Elizabeth Burke Johnson. The reading for tonight is by Anna Irene Saki. It's called Time Between Hours. For 3 days and 3 nights, the wind did not blow. I did not dream, but lay in bed listening to coyotes singing off key in the cattail reeds and cornfields. The wind has gone out of the farm because Dad isn't here, you said. But on the day of the funeral, a breeze like a faint exhale came over the slough, pushing dense heat through our lungs around corners of the house until our muscles ached with longing. Details hung in the air like humidity. Hymns, scripture, flowers, the suit. Death keeps you busy. There wasn't any time for photographs of your father clutching dead pheasants, their marble eyes staring absently into blue sky. No time to consider the smell of grain dust in the air at twilight or the reasons why it is good for the earth to lie fallow, to rest sometimes. But later, time between hours lengthens, and soon there was a little more time to talk about combining at midnight and watching Sputnik satellites make patterns in the North Dakota sky. More time for stories about prairie blizzards and hunting feeds, finding arrowheads buried in the black earth, and your father's memory of seeing bands of Lakota traversing the landscape. As the days passed, there was more time to remember the way he once stood, one hand in his pressed Levi's, the other one low on his sweetheart's waist, as if it were a first date, not a 50th anniversary celebration. And still, there would be more time for the stain of red wine and the precious taste of a fresh grief to settle on our lips. Deacon John Cleveland is a native of the Twin Cities. Growing up in Burnsville, he married his high school sweetheart and attended the University of Minnesota. After college, he entered a career in the life insurance and employee benefits business, where today he is a partner at Seven Hills Cleveland Benefit Partners. As a Roman Catholic, he and his wife, Kathy, have been active parishioners at the Church of St. Therese in Deep Haven. They have 3 adult children and 11 grandchildren, all residing in the area. John was ordained a deacon in the Catholic Church in 2017 and now serves the Guardian Angels Parish in Chaska. John and Kathy enjoy bike riding, skiing, traveling when we're allowed to travel, and going for long walks. He is here tonight to share a personal story of grief. Please welcome Deacon John.
Thank you, Sue. So if you, can you hear me okay? There we go. If you read the brochure, the speaker this evening, it was not Deacon John Cleveland. The speaker is Stu Walker. Does anybody know Stuart Walker? Stu is a good friend of mine. Stu is not well right now, so prayers for Stu Walker. And Stu was going to share with us his story of the loss of his young daughter, Laura. And so Stu called and wasn't able to make it and asked if I could. I've known Stu for probably 20 years, and he was instrumental in really my return to the faith in a deep way. And I don't think I would be ordained a deacon if it wasn't for Stu Walker. So he is a dear friend. So I'm here in Stu's place. I don't have a grief story. So I don't know what many of you are going through. I haven't lost a child. I haven't lost my dear wife, my high school sweetheart. And although I think about that often. And so it's difficult for me to tell you what it's like to grieve when I haven't. In fact, it's impossible because I don't know what you folks are going through. But I do know a story of an author, a book that he wrote, who went through a grief himself. And he wrote a book, C.S. Lewis. Has anybody read A Grief Observed, C.S. Lewis? Okay, well, what I'm going to do this evening is to just introduce you to C.S. Lewis's story, and then maybe encourage you to read the book if you'd have an interest. So a little bit about the book. It's a lovely read, heart-wrenching. And it really, at the end of the day, it's beautiful because throughout the progression, it's exactly what you are all here for. It's growing through loss, is what he describes in his book. It's this beautiful love triangle between him and his wife, Joy Davidson, and God. Now, a little bit about C.S. Lewis and Joy Davidson. I'll introduce you to them, and then we'll go into some of the reflections in the book. So meet Clive Staples Lewis, C.S. Lewis, born in Belfast, Northern Ireland in November of 1898 to a middle-class Catholic family, of course, way up in Belfast. His father was a police court lawyer. His mother died of cancer when he was just 10 years old. So that was probably his first experience with a deep loss. The second one came shortly after because he was shipped off to boarding school then in England. His life changed forever. 2 years later, he returned back to Belfast to boarding school, and then a year after, right back to England. So bounced around from boarding school to boarding school. Then he entered Oxford University through a scholarship. He was brilliant. He enlisted in the Army, World War I, 1917, and experienced the tragedies and just the disaster of war. Was wounded in 1918 and then discharged from the Army. By 1928, he published a few books, and one of his best friends was J.R. Tolkien. You might remember J.R. Tolkien from The Hobbit and also The Lord of the Rings. Just a brilliant author. So they hung out together. They were friends. When he was 31, then his dad died, also of cancer. Another loss. Now, he had become an atheist, first an agnostic, and then an atheist, and this is before his college years. And he remained an atheist until shortly after his dad died in 1931, and then he converted first to theism, the belief in God, and then back to the Christianity, back to the Catholic faith where he had came from. And so an example of growing through loss. You know, the Lord touches us in the deepest ways if we can let him in. when we're the most vulnerable, when we've lost the most. I think many of you know that. Shortly after, he converted back to Christianity, and then in the next 15 years, he published 14 books and was actually on the cover of Time magazine. If you look up in 1946, you'll find C.S. Lewis. Some of his most popular books, Mere Christianity, a great read for people who don't really believe in God. The Great Divorce, Chronicles of Narnia, beautiful story, a series of movies now, of course, and the Screwtape Letters, a beautiful book about Satan and all of his tricks and all of his evils, a great read. He was a giant in Christian and Catholic apologetics. And coming from an atheist, a Catholic, to an atheist, back to a Catholic, through a lot of his suffering. And I think the reflection there in and of itself is how the Lord touches us as we suffer the most. Now let's switch gears. Let's meet somebody named Helen Joy Davidman. Helen Joy Davidman to become C.S. Lewis's beloved wife. Born in 1915, so she was 17 years younger. Born in New York, raised in a middle-class Jewish family. She had a BA at the University of New York, published several poems as an undergrad. She also was a child prodigy, brilliant. At age 25, published her first book, and soon after she became an atheist. And then a member of the Communist Party, and she actually worked part-time for the New York City Communist Party in their newspaper. It was shortly after that she met her husband, William Gresham, also a great author, and they were married in 1942. They had 2 children, David and Douglas. And Gresham, though, was an alcoholic and a serial adulterer. And so their marriage unraveled, which sent Joy into a deep, deep emotional depression, as you can imagine. And she writes, "All my defenses, all the walls of arrogance and overconfidence and self-love behind which I had hid from God, went down momentarily. And when it went down momentarily, that's when God snuck into her life, back into her life." She went in search of her faith and by chance read 3 of C.S. Lewis's books. They'd never met. And the books led her to the Bible, and that led her to the gospel, and that, of course, led her to Jesus Christ. And so being so moved by that, she mustered up enough courage to actually write C.S. Lewis, back in England, a letter, and then they began to correspond back and forth. Then in 1950, she went to England to finish another book, and it was there that she, while in England, actually contacted C.S. Lewis. They met. Shortly after, her husband filed divorce. She returned to England after the divorce, broke, needed financial help, and it was C.S. Lewis and her actual brother who kept her going financially. But by now it was apparent that their friendship had blossomed and become a love affair. And so think about the scandal for a moment. This is in the 50s now. A 58-year-old Oxford, London, renowned, devout Catholic Christian falls in love with a 40-year-old divorced mother of 2. That doesn't sound like a big deal these days, but in those days it certainly was. Soon after, the British government refused to renew her visa, so she had to leave England. And so Lewis civilly married her so that she could stay with him in England. In 1957, she was standing in the kitchen and collapsed. Rushed to the hospital, they found she was filled with cancer and was given just a few weeks to live. It was then that Lewis contacted a priest, and March 21st, 1957, Joy received the Catholic sacraments of anointing, sacrament of holy matrimony, and Holy Communion. And then she was sent home to die with her husband. But she didn't die. The cancer miraculously went into remission, and the 2 were blessed with 3 glorious, happy years. And the friends that knew them said they were like 2 school-aged children having the time of their life. And Lewis commented, "Thou hast kept the good wine until now." However, nonetheless, in spring 1960, the cancer returned just 3 years later, and Joy died on July 13th, 1960. And it was then, less than a month after Joy's death, that C.S. Lewis began to journal and write some of his reflections on what was going through his mind and his grief. And what I'd like to do is just to share some of these reflections with you for the next few minutes. In the book, he's going to question things like, where's God? Can the dead feel the hurt the way the living can? Are the dead really at peace? Is God in fact good? If so, why does he hurt us so much? If our faith crumbles at the first test, what does that say about our faith? Is it even faith at all? So here's some of his most heart-wrenching and poignant thoughts, and listen as we go through this as the progression of healing that seems to be taking place throughout his reflections. One of his first questions, he simply asks, where's God? Lewis voices the sense of abandonment that he feels. It's as if when H died, he called Joy H throughout the book. When H died, God disappeared as well. He writes, where is God? When we're happy, when we're so happy we have no sense of needing him, aren't we all like this? So happy that we're tempted to feel his claim upon us, sometimes an interruption. If you remember yourself and turn to him in gratitude and praise, you'll feel welcomed and warm, and he'll open his arms. But go to him when your needs are desperate, when all your help is in vain. What do you find? A door slammed in your face, and the sound of bolting and double bolting on the inside. This is a man of deep faith, a man who's known for his Christian faith, and this is how he's feeling. Who has not felt like saying, God, I thought you loved me, that you were on my side. Where are you now? As Jesus cries on the cross in Mark chapter 15, verse 34, and as David cries out the same thing in Psalm 22, my God, why have you forsaken me? Then in his deepest grief, he wonders if his memory of H will remain true to her reality. He mentions he hates those pithy little comments that good-meaning people say, things like, she will live forever in my memory. Live, that's exactly what she won't do. You might as well think that she's like an old Egyptian, that you can just keep the dead, by embalming them, keeping them from dead by embalming them. It was H that I loved, as if I wanted to fall in love with my memory of her and imagine her in my own mind. No, he wanted her back. Then he questions whether H is really in God's hands at all. He asks very pointed questions of the basic goodness of God. Is God even good? Remember, these are the thoughts of a world-renowned Christian writer. He writes, she is in God's hands is a well-known aphorism one hears when a loved one dies, or equally common, she's at peace. How can we be sure that she is, in fact, at peace? How do we know that there's no anguish on the other side? How do they know that she really is at rest? Why should the separation, which so agonizes the lover who is left behind, be painless to the lover who departs? How do we know that the dead are in fact in God's hands? She was in God's hands all the time, and I have seen what they did to her here. Do they suddenly become gentler to us the moment we are out of our body? These are thoughts of pain. He goes on, is this a realistic possibility or just a cry of a grieving husband? Do the dead hurt? Does all feeling end when we die? Is there heartache on the other side, even in heaven? Is God's goodness consistent with hurting us? For if it is, then he must hurt us after death as unendurably is before us. Then he falls deeper and deeper into doubt and hopelessness of the goodness of God, the God he loves, and he spent his life writing about. And he even suggests that God is some kind of a cosmic sadist, he calls him. He writes, what chokes every prayer and hope is the memory of all our prayers with H that we offered and all the false hopes that we had. Not hopes raised merely by our own wishful thinking, hopes encouraged, even forced upon us by false diagnoses, by x-rays, by strange remissions. He's, of course, talking about H's cancer, by one temporary recovery that might have ranked as a miracle. Step by step, we were led up the garden path, time after time, when he seemed most gracious. He was really preparing for the next torture. This is a very, very deeply hurt man. But the following day, he seems to come to his senses a bit. He begins to feel actually guilty about the things that he was thinking about earlier and writing about, journaling about. But he still feels much pain. He writes, I wrote that last night. I was a yell rather than a thought. Is it rational to believe in a bad God? In a God as bad as all that? A cosmic sadist? A spiteful imbecile? Why do I make room in my mind for such filth and nonsense? Do I hope that if feelings disguise itself as thoughts, I shall feel less? Aren't all these notes the senseless writings of a man who won't accept the fact that there is nothing we can do with suffering except to suffer it? Who still thinks that there's some device which we can take the pain away? It doesn't really matter if you grip the arms of a dentist's chair or let your hands lie in your lap. The drill drills on. The pain keeps coming. And now his thoughts turn to his faith. Again, he was an icon of faith to the world, but he so questions God. He asks if suffering is a measure of his faith and if his faith is collapsing in the face of the real test. Sometimes our faith collapses when it's really tested. And was his faith in God real all along, or was it just imagined? He writes, I've been warned. I had warned myself not to reckon on worldly happiness. We were even promised sufferings. If my house had collapsed at one blow, that's because it was a house of cards. The faith which took these things into account was not faith, but my imagination. I must surely admit that if my house was a house of cards, the sooner it was knocked down, the better. And only suffering can do that. If I had really cared, as I thought I did, about the sorrow of the world, I should not have been so overwhelmed when my own sorrow came. Questioning his faith. But then he concludes, this test of faith is not for God to determine the quality of your faith, but for you. Test of faith is for us to determine the quality of our faith. God has not been trying the experiment on my faith or love in order to find out their quality. He knew it already. It was I who didn't know. And then a turning point begins in the book. A turning point in his grief seems to begin, and it seemed to happen at a point where he realized that he was preoccupied with himself rather than with H, with his beloved. And after this insight, his grief seemed to become a little more bearable. He writes, "What sort of lover am I to think so much about my affliction and so much less about hers? Even the insane words, 'Come back,' is all for my sake. I never even raised the question whether such a return, if it were possible, was good for her. I want her back as an ingredient in the restoration of my past. But could I have wished her anything worse? Having gone once through death, to come back and then at some later date have to die over again. They call Stephen the first martyr. Hasn't Lazarus the raw ordeal?" Then one day, he writes, his heart was lighter than it had been for many weeks. He writes, "Time and distance placed a different lens on H's death. It was as if H's essence became clear when it was not clouded by tears and grief. At the very moment when I mourned H least, I remembered her best. It was as if the lifting of the sorrow removed a barrier. You can't see anything properly while your eyes are blurred with tears. You can't get what you want if you want it too desperately. It was as if grief created suspense. It comes from the frustration of so many impulses that had become habitual. Thought after thought, feeling after feeling, action after action had H for their object. And of course, the suspense is never resolved. It only fades away when the sense of grief dissipates. And finally, he becomes at peace with her passing, at peace with the idea of celebrating her life, their time together, and now celebrating their memories together. He writes, "There is hidden or flaunted a sword between the sexes until the entire marriage reconciles them. Jointly the two become fully human, in the image of God's created. If, as I can't help suspecting, the dead also feel the pain of separation, then for both lovers, without exception, bereavement is a universal and integral part of our experience of love. It follows marriage as normally as marriage follows courtship, or as autumn follows summer." What a beautiful image that the two spouses who carried this life or brought this life or enjoyed this life and grew with each other in this life equally miss each other when they're separated through life and death, in hopes that someday they will be reunited. He writes, "Passionate grief does not link us with the dead, but cuts us off from them. It's just at those moments when I feel the least sorrow that each rushes upon my mind in her full reality of her otherness. Not as in my worst moments, but as she is, in her own right. This is good and tonic. I will turn to her as often as possible with gladness. I will even salute her with a laugh. The less I mourn her, the nearer I seem to be with her." It's a beautiful story of exactly what you're here for: growing through loss, growing through grief. And the grief stems from two sources. Of course, the heartbreak of losing his beloved, his soulmate, his kindred spirit, but also from the feeling of being abandoned by God, the God whom you and I expect to be a caregiver and a comforter and a protector. And my sense is many of these same thoughts and feelings are going through your hearts and your lives. And it's comforting to know that one of the most staunch Christians respected men, respected authors of the 20th century, feels the same way. It's a part of who we are in the human heart and the loss. So I would encourage you to read a Grief Observed. It could just as easily be called Growing Through Loss. It seems the turning point for Lewis, and maybe for us sometimes, is when our thoughts and our feelings and our prayers become maybe a little less focused on ourselves and more focused on God and our beloved, if we can get to the point of doing that. So I asked Stu, we were to hear his story this evening, so I asked Stu, I said, for any comments on this. And he wrote to me this. He said, one important thing about a tragedy like this is it either turns people towards God or it turns people away from God. And it seems normal to turn people away from God for a time. But then doesn't the Lord always draw us back at our weakest moments? And so maybe look for those moments and look for those feelings and look for those times, those people that he brings into our lives to slowly draw us back. Stu told me that his choice to turn to God for comfort, and God answered him by giving him a grace to accept his daughter's death and to grieve and to move forward. And the Lord did this in ways that he never, ever, ever could have done on his own. So take a look at A Grief Observed by C.S. Lewis, if that will help you. And I hope this has maybe helped you a little bit. Questions at all? Anybody? Okay, well, it's been a pleasure being with you. Yes. Yes. It's called A Grief Observed. It's a short little read. I read it on an airplane. The kid next to me couldn't figure out why I was starting to cry. Yeah, very simple. Take a picture. Okay. Any other questions, anybody? Well, thank you for the opportunity to be here. This is a beautiful organization, and it's good that you're here.
Thanks again, John. We appreciate you being here. And I was supposed to mention that he was here in place of Stuart Walker, but he did that, so you know he's not Stuart. He's a John. Our program next week is Grief as a Family Affair with Janice Winchester Nadeau, who is a licensed psychologist, marriage and family therapist. And the groups today, I will announce them, and we're starting early. So I'm thinking we could end early too if people want to get going to get home. So instead of ending at 9, I would say you should end at 8:45. Okay, so facilitators, if you could help make that happen, all right? Loss of spouse, there will be 4 groups. Jill Peterson across from the boiler room, Phyllis Anderson in Fellowship Hall, Dwayne Nelson in Fellowship Hall, and John Dahl across from the restrooms. So those are the same locations we used last week. If you're not sure what group to go to, come and see me because we have a few new people tonight. Loss of child will be in the choir room with Nancy Matheson. Loss of parent will be in the coffee house with Tom Schlor and Jack Anderson. Transitional loss will be with Charlotte Drone and Sue Thompson in the chapel. And suicide survivors with Michelle Gustafson and Darlene Forgy in the youth room. And if you need any help getting to those places, let me know and I can direct you.